Hello, Isaac.
Hello, Rabbi. Happy pre-Shabbos. It's great to
Thank
see
you.
you.
I'm looking at you. I see your shirt matches the background. That's a
Background,
great
yeah.
decision.
Well,
Me,
I'm
I just
sorry.
try to match the ocean and the sky.
I'm sorry I didn't get the memo about a blue T-shirt, or else
I'll
I
try
would
to
have.
send the memo in advance. Sorry about that. Okay,
Well, happy.
today, instead
Hmm.
of continuing of where we spoke, where we left off, what we're going to do instead is try to read our two stories so we hear and feel. So what I want you to do before you read, you're going to read 9:18 to 26. I want you to feel the two stories. I want you to try to be aware of where one story finishes. I want you to try to be aware where the next story starts, where the next story finishes, where the first story starts again, and the first story finishes. That's I want you to try to get those feelings and that sensitivity as you're reading. Okay.
Well, on that note, the Gospel according to Matthew, chapter 9, verse 18 onwards. While he was saying these things to them, behold, a ruler came in and knelt before him, saying, My daughter has just died, but come and lay your hand on her, and she will live. And Jesus rose and followed him with his disciples. And behold, a woman who had suffered from a discharge of blood for 12 years came up behind him and touched the fringe of his garment. For she said to herself, If I only touch his garment, I will be made well. Jesus turned, and seeing her, he said, Take heart, daughter, your faith has made you well. And instantly the woman was made well. And when Jesus came to the ruler's house and saw the flute players and the crowd making a commotion, he said, Go away, for the girl is not dead, but sleeping. And they laughed at him. But when the crowd had been put outside, he went in and took her by the hand, and the girl arose. And the report of this went through all that district.
Okay, Isaac, first, did you notice that there's two stories?
Yes, uh-huh. Yes,
Did
we are.
it, did,
Well,
does
I
it does it feel weird to you that there's a beginning of a story and then a new story and the new story finishes and then a second story? It'd be equivalent to saying one, two A,
mhm.
two B, and then I guess you said one B.
I think
So
there's more, right? So it starts, the first story is he was talking to them, and then this guy walks in, right? So he was talking to them. Would that be one story, or is that so? Would you look at this just as context? So when I look at this, that's in he was first talking with an audience, and then some other guy walks in. So the audience is story A. This ruler, that will be story B. He walks in, and then he
who
says,
walked?
"Let's
One
go."
second. What are you saying? Walk. First, the first story is the story of the ruler. He walks in. That's story one
Well,
A. The guy walks
while
in, right?
while he was saying these things to them, would that not qualify like he's
Oh,
in the story
so
to
I view
begin
that
with?
as a transition. So if you look throughout Matthew, we have unlimited transitional sentences. So if you look
Hmm.
even the next verse, Matthew 9:27, it says, and Jesus went on from there. If you look at Matthew 9:32, after they had gone away. And then if you look at it goes, Matthew does a really good job of connecting these things, and they do this throughout. So I would argue, for example, if I say that if I'm telling you a story and I said, I start the story saying, I just got off the phone and I started speaking to Isaac. So that would be part of the story. That wouldn't be a separate story. So while he was saying these things to them, suddenly a leader, that's actually the first part of the story. Like, if you're going to set this up as theater, you would have him, the scene wouldn't be, there would be a whole nother scene of people speaking. The opening scene would be him speaking to people and someone coming in. This is the
Hmm.
opening scene. So
Hmm.
this is not a set, that is not a separate story. That's just a
Okay.
transitional sentence.
Transitional sense. Okay, so in that case, the first story is this guy comes, kneels down, say, "My daughter is just died." That's
And if
story
you look, I
B.
just want to, this maybe this is something that you could try to take note of in Matthew from now on. Matthew does this all the time. Matthew, if anything, is meant to feel, I mentioned to you this before, a sense of hecticness. There's supposed
Hmm.
to be in Matthew a sense of A leads to B. So if you look at the Gadarene demons, when he came to the other sides of the country, this happened. When you look at the healing of the paralytic, and after getting into the boat, he crossed the sea. There's always like this transition sentence, and I think this is something that is a little bit more specific to Matthew than to other places. But I'd be open to hearing. Obviously, Mark and Luke both do it, but usually when people write, they don't do this as much. If you're thinking
Hmm.
about how it works in theater, you would have the person say the set the stage and set the background. So this is what we see in Matthew. There's always this setting of the stage, setting the background to lead from point to point. And it's a good question a meta question about why is the evangelist so worried about giving you that feeling that Jesus is always hopping from
Hmm.
story to story? That's a great question. We're not going to talk about that today, or
Okay.
not so much.
Fair enough. So the first story is this guy walking and saying, My daughter has just died." Jesus walks, gets up to go with him. And then story two is this woman who comes in behind him, touches the fringe of his garment. Jesus says, "Take heart, daughter, your faith has made you well." And then she was made well. And then we're back at the first story where he's in the house and he says she's not dead, but she's sleeping. People laughed at him and he took her by the hand and she rose.
So I want to note for you, for example, even if you want to say this is how the chronology of the story happened, that would be you could always explain any situation of a story within a story or two stories that are happening overlapping that this is just the chronology. A lot of times you'll see in a movie, you'll have an A plot and a B plot, and it'll
Hmm.
go back and forth, A, B, A, B, A, B. And then at the final scene, there'll be that the A and B plot will meet. We know like the TV show Seinfeld did that. But if you look at this example, this feels more like a story within a story or an embedded narrative. A lot of times, like you see, like maybe in the play Hamlet, where where a story is actually being told by the narrator. So, in general, in Christian circles, this would be called intercalation. And this is when we have a story within a story. Or maybe some people call this maybe the sandwich effect, that you have two pieces and they sandwich in another story. And if you just want to say chronologically, this is what happened. That's definitely sometimes you could say that. But if you want to maybe compare other examples in Matthew, just for example, the cursing of the fig and cleansing of the temple, what happens in Matthew 21:12 to 22, you see that Jesus is cursing a barren fig tree, and then Jesus enters the temple and drives out the money changers. And then the story finishes. The next day, the disciples see the fig tree withered and discuss the event with Jesus. So chronology always allows you to kind of take that attitude, but a lot of times you'll see that sometimes we get done with a topic before we move on. Another example of this intercalation in Matthew or the sandwich effect is the betrayal of Judas and the anointing of Bethany that happens in chapter 26 of Matthew 6:16. So we have the chief priests plot to arrest Jesus. Jesus is anointed at Bethany by a woman who smells of expensive perfume. And then the story finishes. The narrative it goes back to Judea, and he goes to the chief priests and agree to betray Jesus. So we see that at least in Matthew, and I'd say in the synoptics in general, we have like this sense of going back and forth. I'll give you one last example just so you see it's not like a one-off. I'm trying to limit my examples to Matthew, but in Matthew in 14:1 to 13, we have the death of John the Baptist and the mission of the disciples. So we have the passage, how does it begin? It begins with Herod hearing about Jesus and reflecting on John the Baptist. Then there's a flashback to the account of John's arrest and execution. In that case, it's such a good example because the flashback, it's like saying, hold on, let me give you some context. Let me stop the story because this is important. And then the story has a finish. After the flashback, the story returns to Jesus withdrawing from the boat to a solitary place and after hearing of John's death. So all these examples of intercalation or the sandwich effect are I want to note, like somewhat common in Matthew. B, most of them could be explained by saying this is how it chronologically happened. But I wanted you to feel that chronology is not enough to explain it. If someone's telling a story and then another story happens, it's not a best practice of storytellers in
Hmm.
order to tell the story in the most robust and clear way to stop the story and then go on. Imagine when the book of Matthew was an oral tradition before it got written down. You know, I don't know we talked about when Matthew was written. Pretty much everyone agrees it's after Mark, but before a certain point. So let's say it's written in the year 70 to 90 at some point, just for argument's sake. That means a lot of these traditions would have had to float around until they're written down by Mark, until the book of Matthew was edited. So you have an oral tradition. Imagine now these verses, 9:18 to 26, being 1a, 2a, 2b, 1b, as an oral tradition. It would have felt discombobulated. It would have felt confused. It would have been experienced by the listener as, why are you telling it that? Even if it's chronologically makes sense. Tell one story, finish the story, and they're both really good stories, and they're very similar stories, if anything, right?
Hmm.
They're both a sick person. One either is dead or on the verge of dying, depending on how you read the synoptic parallels. The other one is a person who's been suffering for 12 years, maybe 12 years old, and Jesus heals them. At the end of the day, I could summarize both stories. There's a sick person and then they're healed. There, I summarize them. So if why not just have them one after another? Not only that, the very next story that we're going to see, we'll see 927, 931. What's the story? The blind men healed. I could have made this even more confusing. I could have done 1A, 2A, and then I could have said, and Jesus went on, two blind men followed him, and I could have interjected and intercalated those stories. So I feel that I want to investigate with you this concept of intercalation. I want to look at some of the biblical precedents. It's not actually so common in the Pentateuch, but we'll talk about. I try to hone in on one example, and then I want to give you and I want to think of some theories about why the author, the evangelist of Matthew, thought it'd be best to either keep the story chronologically accurate or B, keep it as an intercalated story, especially when we keep in mind the oral tradition that would have existed as a foundation of these verses of Matthew. Sound
Hmm.
good so far?
Yeah,
Got our
sounds good. Yeah,
got our
yeah,
goals?
yeah. So it's interesting, but I had not thought about this, right? So yes, he has one story within a story, which is it's not a great way of telling a story. He could have had the story of that he healed the daughter, and then said while he was going, this woman happened. So it could have been two stories said differently versus trying to fit one story within another story, split this into two. It's an
Right.
interesting. It's
The truth is, it depends on the situation, right? I'll tell you a quick story. I wasn't going to mention this, but I remember one time I was at a Friday night dinner and there was a new rabbi. I think it was the first time I heard him speak, and he decided to tell a story. And I think he wanted to show he's a storyteller, which is like, a higher level, an orator. He started telling a story, and pretty much the crux of his story was that he was telling a story within a story within a story.
I can
Okay.
imagine where this
So
is going.
so everyone was completely confused. And I looked at Esther and I'm like, I don't know why of all the billions of stories out there that he could have chosen as his initiation of this situation where he's trying to be our new like orator, our new storyteller leader, he would tell the most confusing story possible. And so, I just had to like smile and wave, like, yay, good job. But I remember when I experienced this concept of a story, this his was a story within a story within a story, it was very confusing. And so when I was trying to think of examples in the Pentateuch, in the five books of Moses, of this, I realized that it's actually really interesting. The Pentateuch has very different models of this because number one, we have no less than, let's say, 10 stories that happen twice in the Pentateuch. So
Hmm.
that's not a story within a story as much as a contradictory story, a contrasting story. Are they both happening again? Are they two separate stories? Did Moses hit the rock twice? Did how come the spy stories are told twice? So it's not a story within a story, but if you think about it, the whole Pentateuch is inherently a story, right?
Hmm.
It's a story from Genesis until Moses died. And then within it, there's a lot of stories and there are tangents. For example, when the Jews, when Israelites sing the song by the sea, that's kind of like a song within a story.
Hmm.
You could have just said they sang a song or the Jacob blessed the sons. But then when you give this almost half tangential, half on topic perspective, you are kind of going on a side point. So what I want to do with you is just to start to investigate one. There's so many examples, but I thought it'd be fun because we don't do this very often to investigate one specific example. And the
Hmm.
specific example, I'm gonna let you look it up if you want. It's in Genesis 38. So I'm using this example because you're going to be aware of this example before I say it. And when you look at Genesis 38, as I see you turning the pages of your handy Bible,
Hmm.
you'll notice that what we see over here is the story of Judah, where
King.
he tries to where he fathers some children, his children die, and then he fathers the progenitor of the Davidic line. Great. But what we see right before this, at the end of chapter 37, we're in the middle of the story of Joseph, where Judah is definitely a character, a player in the story, but it's the
Hmm.
story of Joseph and how he's being sold. And then right after we finish this whole story of Judah and what he did and how he goes and has children and they die and he remarries. And then he realizes his daughter-in-law he had relations with his daughter-in-law who dressed like a prostitute, et cetera, et cetera. Chapter 39 goes right back. And Joseph had been brought down to Egypt. What's interesting is both chapter 38 and 39 have these verses to start, 38, 1, 38, 9, start with this interjection, this transition sentence. If you look at 38, it was at that time that Judah went down. Like, it's almost like, why are you saying that? And they're saying, it's about that time that Judah did this. Okay, so that's a good transition. And we look at 39, 1, we see, and Joseph had been brought down to Egypt. Okay, sounds good. It's almost like it's reminding you. Joseph, it turns out, had already been brought down to Jesus to
Egypt.
Egypt, and we're hearing this now. Because if you look at the end of 37, 36, last verse of 37, now the Midianites had sold him to Egypt, to Potiphar, the courtier of Pharaoh, the chamberlain and butcher. So it could be that he was sold and then he arrived in Egypt, but it's almost like just like a good transition sentence does. It's telling us where you are in the story because
Hmm.
I had an intercalation, I had
Hmm.
a sandwich story, I had a tangent. Okay,
Hmm.
so
Yeah,
what?
so
Yeah,
speaking of that, right now, as you mentioned that, I noticed that chapter 40 as well starts with now sometime after this. And then when I see, what's the one I saw? Probably a verse before, a chapter where it's like around this time, now this happened. Joseph had been brought down to Egypt. It happened around this time, sometime after this. It's a way
Isaac,
of
on your topic, my favorite transition sentence is the first one in the Bible. In the beginning,
in the beginning.
and there was so in other words, there was something, and then now we have this point in the beginning. Because I'm
Yeah.
not going to talk to you about what happened before. I'm going to start at the in the beginning of time. That's where I'm going to start. Because I'm going to transition from something I'm not going to talk to you about. So the Bible is replete. The Bible is so full of stories of transitions because the Bible tries to sometimes like I give you a bunch of examples where it'll say, now that we were just talking about that, let's talk about that again. Okay, so
Hmm.
the Bible is written by, written well enough that it has transition sentences. So what
Hmm.
I
Yep.
want to do today is really quickly, I want to give you just three medieval examples of what the medieval commentators, what Jews call Rishonim, do with this verse 38 1. Uh, and then I want to try to use that as a principle to try to understand what we're supposed to take from our verses in Matthew. So when we look at 38:1, the first commentator I want to point out is Rashi, 1040, 1105, Rabbi Yitzhak, very famous, probably the most famous of the Jewish commentators. He says, and this is not going to be in your Bible, but you can still look at the verse. The verse said, 38:1, about that time, by he, but at that time, Judah left his brothers and camped near a certain Adulamite, some race of people, whose name was Chira. So all the commentators point out, like, why does it say about that time? So first we see Rashi. Rashi says, why is this section placed here, thus interrupting the section dealing with the history of Joseph? Our exact question. Rashi, a keen reader of the Bible, has the same problem that we have because I read him already. I knew it was a problem. To teach, so why, Rashi says, why did he do that? To teach that his brothers degraded him from his high position. When they saw their father's grief that Joseph had been sold, the brothers, the other 10 brothers, said to Judah, you told us to sell him to sell Joseph. If you had told us to send him back and return him to his father Jacob, we would have obeyed you. So it wants to say that it was lower in their eyes, and now it almost tells like a degrading story of him, where he literally sleeps with his daughter-in-law because he refuses to do a levirate marriage. So the point and this is quoted from the Medrash. So this is quoted purposely in order to tell you that we want you to feel that just like he was degraded before, this was degrading as well. Okay,
So
so that's
this is somebody saying what goes around comes around. Judah degraded his brother Joseph, and now he's been degraded. Like he slept with his daughter-in-law, which is not okay. And so it sounds like what he's saying is the focus of 38. It's placed out of context to show that he did this to his brother, and now this is happening to him and his daughter-in-law. Is that what I'm hearing you say?
Yeah, and I'll just give
Yeah.
you a little more explanation. So this person says the Torah, the Pentateuch, is not putting the passage of Judah at this particular point in order to teach us that it occurred immediately after Joseph was sold. It doesn't care about the chronology. It might feel like Vayhi Vayitahi, it was at this time that this is chronological, it's happening. But what this person is explaining that Rashi says is that the chronology doesn't matter at all. For the time of the incident itself is not significant. We would have expected scripture to first conclude the narration of Joseph's story and then go back and relate other people. So the Maral, that's how the Maral explains this, Rashi. So in other words, the chronology doesn't matter. And really, we want to, there's an idea that's important that wants to be shared. And therefore, the idea is that Judah went down in status. And by juxtaposing this story with the earlier story, it's showing that his degradation. So that's one commentary. Another person who is Ibn Ezra, and he says the Bible places this chapter here to contrast the behavior of Joseph vis-a-vis his master's wife with that of Judah towards his daughter-in-law. So just as Joseph rose to the occasion when he was trying to be enticed and seduced by Potiphar, his master's wife, Judah literally went to a prostitute who happened to be his daughter-in-law. What? Okay, so in other words, it's saying just as Joseph was such a righteous guy, Judah was completely lacking. And they cut this story to show that I want you to see really how amazing Joseph is in
Hmm.
contrast to Judah. So that's how Ibn Ezra explains this. That's our second one. So also degrading to Judah, very similar to Rashi, but degrading in a different way. The last person that we'll see is the Sforno, a little later person. But it says, and it came to pass at the time Joseph was sold to Egypt due to Judah's counsel, advising to sell him and not advising to return him to the father, thus bereaving his father Jacob. Judah was requited according to the fruits of his actions by having two sons who would die prematurely, and thus he remained bereaved by his father. So Sforno says very differently. Definitely, it's meant to be a degrading story of Judah, but just as Jacob was bereaved for more than 2 decades because his son Joseph was in Egypt and stolen from him, so too Judah was bereaved when he had two sons die, and then he didn't want to marry his daughter-in-law Tamar or give off his daughter-in-law Tamar to his third son because he's worried that he's going to die again. So therefore, the bereavement is the parallel. So if we had to stop right now and we'd say, how do these Jewish commentators view an intercalation? How do they view a story being sandwiched in Mosaic? In other words, they look for a value, look for a message. Chronology is not enough. Okay, and we could do 1,000 other examples. I just looked up this one because I knew you know the story, and I found it interesting. I couldn't remember why it was intercalated. Okay, let's go back to Jesus, right? That's what you're here for, Isaac. So
I'm
let's go
here
back to
to
Jesus.
learn.
And so now, what I want you to do is you, Isaac, brainstorm. Why is there an intercalation here? Keeping in mind that we don't care about chronology. So I have 3 or 4 answers, but I wanted to give you a couple seconds to think about it. Why? Just remind you, 1A is the story of a father saying, "My daughter is dead, please," or sick, heal her. The next one is a woman who is 2A is a woman who's sick, 12 years bleeding, and then she touches Jesus's robe.
Hmm.
She gets healed. That's 2B. And then 1B is that he goes to the person's house has a sick daughter, and he says, by faith, you'll be healed. And she gets healed. So that's the two.
Yeah, Rabbi, when you think about this, right? So one and two are complete exact opposites. He tells a woman, just believe and she'll be healed. But he does not tell that he does not tell that to the ruler, right? The
It's
ruler's
interesting.
coming. He's
So,
coming saying, my daughter is dead. If you were to take what Jesus said to the woman, if you take like the 2A, and it's where he told her, take heart, daughter, your faith has made you well, right? We discussed this yesterday. He could have told the father, hey, take heart, your daughter has been made whole. I
you
find
know,
this surprising. So,
Isaac,
to
there's a
answer
lot to expand on what you're saying because when you compare Matthew to Mark and Luke, we didn't do this because I try to stay Matthew focused, and Mark and Luke are so much longer in this story. And if anything, just because the famous thing in the Mark and Luke story is that she touches Jesus without him knowing, and she gets healed without him knowing, and he feels like some power was taken from him. So when we look at the Mark and Luke story, it's almost like a different story. It's about how magic works. Where if you look at the Jesus story, sorry, the Matthew story, He says, "Take heart, daughter, your faith has made you well." So I think that all three stories finish with "Your faith has made you well," but really Mark and Luke is about the touching, is the touching of the cloak is what really heals, and the faith is not as much. So I don't know if that impacts what you're saying, but for me, I feel the point of Matthew is the faith, while the point of Mark and Luke is not the faith. So I just want to
Mhm.
note like the biblical the the synoptic parallels give you like a little bit different feel for all these stories because Mark and Luke are so much expanded. It's very rare to have Mark so much longer. Mark is the longest of the three stories amongst these two stories. So it's rare to have Luke being shorter and then Matthew being the shortest. Okay. Anyways,
Okay,
so as you were saying,
so back to your question, right? Back to your question, why were these two placed together? What is the point in all this? Um, is it to show that, dead people don't rise from the dead? It's very rare. It doesn't happen. It doesn't happen. I know we discussed the last time that this thing of sleeping, right? People when after people die, some of them we don't quite know if they're dead. They would keep for a few days to
no,
see
but
if
for
they.
sure, like resurrection is rare. So and I think that's really so. The first answer you're saying is that these two stories are connected. They demonstrate Jesus' power over sick people and life and death. The two stories together, they're able to highlight Jesus' power not only over death, but over chronic sickness because she was sick for 12 years. So we want to put these together because it almost like one story tells one thing. Another story would just be Brutus, but by sticking together, it's like this is what Jesus does.
Hmm.
So that's the first answer. I think that's a really good answer. My only problem with that answer is that there's so many stories of Jesus healing throughout
Hmm.
Matthew. Not only that, like we're about to hear the two blind men healed, the healing of demonic who was mute. We have so many healings in Matthew that I feel that while splicing the stories and intercalating the stories into one, you do get this feeling that Jesus could do whatever. We
Yes,
get that we get the whole this whole chapter feels that way to me. That
but
Jesus, so
yeah,
I question that why we would splice these two stories and not all the stories.
yeah. So the second one would be, right. We discussed that this woman, by based on the purity law, she would have been untouchable because she would be impure.
Oh,
She
going
cannot
back
come
to what we said, I like it, Isaac.
temple, right? And so in some case, in a case, right, it is being that he healed the one at the lowest, the lowest member of the society, and then so that said, a child, right? She does not have any social status in that day and age. Like today in America, yes, we care about children, but I can imagine 2,000 years ago that people cared about children the way we care about now. I mean, the older you get was much, and so in a way, it was showing that it was reinforcing that message as in Jesus cared about
Okay, great answer, Isaac. So
yeah, this is
So you're
great. See,
you're
I'm
two good
getting.
answers so far. So the first one was demonstration of Jesus' power over sicknesses, even chronic sickness, life, death. Your second answer is that there are meek people, and we want to contrast of desperation and faith. So a woman, she was so desperate, she snuck up on Jesus. She touched his cloak. She hoped the magic would work. And the other girl was so meek, she was dead. We see that the story shows Jesus' compassion for all people. You got the high ruler of the Jew, probably one of the most powerful people. He's either called the ruler or the leader of the synagogue, and he's probably something that would have been exciting to go and heal. And he stops that for a second. He goes, "I have to deal with this girl right now." So regardless of the status, and one thing that I want to point out, when I was looking at all this, I tried to look at all the stories that Jesus heals. Jesus almost only heals men. We have Bethany and a couple other things, but these are actually two women stories. And I
Mhm,
don't know if that's a good reason. I don't want like if that's a good enough reason to have the stories to be intercalated. But I do think that we have two women's stories, and you could argue that the dead girl is really a story of her father, and he's the one who's calling.
mhm,
But I do think it's important to note that Jesus doesn't care if it's the ruler of the synagogue or the girl who's impure, who's been sick for at least 12 years
mhm,
and Jesus is willing to help them. Both individuals shows he's compassionate to
mhm,
everyone, just as we saw in the Beatitudes,
mhm,
and he doesn't care about social standing. So that's your second
mhm.
answer. Isaac,
Yeah,
great answer, and I think that that really
and my,
stresses in this story.
Yeah, and my third answer is still faith, right? So in this case, that the father had faith, he came, he knelt down, saying, "He's just died, but come and lay a hand on her, and she will live," right? And so we saw that the woman had desperation, like she had faith. Earlier was she had some type, she had, or 22 where she had faith, and in this case, it also highlights the faith where faith, like you can have faith for somebody else. In this case, it's a father having
Wow,
faith for his.
Isaac, you have okay, third good answer. We're doing great. So now we're going to talk about how these two stories both have highlighted in faith. Number
Yeah.
one, when the girl is desperate on the deathbed and or dead, her father doesn't give up on her. He has faith that she could be healed. He has faith that Jesus could heal. The girl who has been sick for 12 years has faith that Jesus, by touching his cloak, could heal. So these people believe in Jesus as a miracle worker, as a healer, as a representative of the divine at a higher level, because otherwise they wouldn't go to him. So these
Hmm.
two stories are intercalated in order to focus, according to Isaac, Stephen Raj, in order to show that they are people of higher faith. And not only that, not only the sick girl, but even the father must have higher
Hmm.
faith. So I think that's a really great answer. My only criticism of that answer is the same criticism I have in the first answer. We have throughout Matthew other examples of people who have high faith, specifically the centurion servants. So I feel that we don't have them intercalated. My criticism is not a defeater. It just says that it's just pointing that it's for me it's problematic that these two stories are chosen as opposed to like sticking them all in one section. Maybe we should have the just like we have the Beatitudes just like stooped in and stuck in. Maybe we should have
Hmm.
all the stories that people have faith. But I think good. So let's review. We have one that Jesus demonstrates his power of life over death. Number two, Jesus shows compassion to the meek, to the strong, everyone alike. Number three, we have Jesus. These stories show very high levels of faith. Great.
Hmm.
Isaac, you want to keep going? Any more?
I think no, I think
You're good. You're done.
maybe, yeah, maybe
So I actually Googled. I Googled.
maybe
Yeah, go on.
just one last thing would be that he didn't care what people thought of him, right? So in the case of the daughter of healing the daughter, people mocked him like she's not dead. Like when he said she's sleeping, they laughed at him, but he didn't seem to care about this. And then we don't have any context to what for like on 21 when this woman showed up and she was impure. We don't know what people around Jesus would have said. I think it's fair that people would have said, "Wow, like this did this really happen?"
Well,
And
I
so,
feel
but
that I hear what you're saying, but I feel that's maybe a subcategory if he's a compassionate guy. So we already said that he doesn't care about the circumstances. So you're saying it's even more so. I'll give you like a subcategory. I'm not going to give this a new answer. I'll say this is a subcategory that these people were lowly people, and he could have been embarrassed to even deal with these people, and he
Mhm.
wasn't. So I think that's a subcategory of compassion for the meek and desperate. But okay, I hear that as a subcategory. Okay, Isaac. So you're up to one, two, three A and three B. Okay, let me
I'm
give you
done.
what I did. I Googled this, just want to see what people said. And it's very interesting. I think if you're a priest or a minister, there's actually one message that you and I didn't say that is super focused on. I feel like this is what everyone says on it. And I thought it was very interesting. The thing that I think, if you want to make a sermon on this, what people say is that God doesn't work on your terms. God will interrupt the things that you think is your job to do. Jesus thought it was his job now to follow the leader of the synagogue. And that's why he's the most high one. He's not the high priest, but he's a high level official. And Jesus thought he's supposed to follow him. But no, when you have a girl who's bleeding and has nothing, the plans that you lay out, God will change. You can't just go and do what you're told. So there's an
I
idea.
don't see, I don't see that connection, right? Like he's just going along the way. It's not like he went on a different path. I mean,
He
he's
stopped.
walking
He
away.
stopped doing what he's doing, and he
Yeah,
dealt with this girl because this
yeah.
was the primary. Because God then sent this girl to her. So you have this idea of like divine timing. So the interruption of the story itself illustrates the divine timing. How what God wants to stick in front of you is not always what you want stuck in front of you. So while the priest, not I'm sorry, the official of the synagogue, the ruler, whatever he was, might have been anxious about his daughter's death, and according to like if you look at the Mark Luke parallels, yes, in our story, she's dead. In the other one is she's dying, and then she is dead. So his delay actually caused her to die. It even strengthens this message of interruption and divine timing,
Hmm.
because maybe had Jesus gone according to the Luke and Mark story, she might have lived and she might not even needed to be resurrected. But
Hmm.
only because he stopped for this girl who was sick for 12 years did she die, and therefore she needs to be resurrected. So that's not true in Matthew, but I think we see that this divine timing, and I think from a sermonic level about what people are worried about, that's definitely, I think, one of the central themes that if you're a good Christian today, this is one of the messages I think that you would want. Because I think a lot of times when people view religion today, they want to see God intervening at every moment. And this is one of the things when we talked about, sapiential eschatology is where you see God's not really intervening every moment as opposed to other kinds of divine providence. So in this story, the point is that God will stop you what you're doing in order to have something else. So I think I actually like the last answer the most, not because I think it's the best read, but because it takes into point account the meta problem. Why is there intercalation? And it takes into account it's in the story, so it takes into account both of those two.
So, Rabbi, so are you saying that the primary focus of these two passages is to show that God can intervene, that he can, even the best plans can be interrupted by
Yeah, yeah.
God.
So Jesus is like look what Jesus said. Jesus got up and followed him with his disciples. Jesus is on his way. Then suddenly, very excitingly, a woman who had been suffering from bleeding for 12 years came on, and another story happened. So I think that we mentioned many times there's a certain hecticness to Matthew. And I do think you feel this, that this is happening, and then this is happening, and then this person intervenes, and Jesus does this, and maybe Jesus is controlling this, maybe not. So there's this hecticness that is felt in the intercalating of two stories. Whenever you have sandwich stories, you feel two things are happening at once. It's almost like you are um, accomplishing multiple things. You're multitasking in a story while you're reading. You're just multitasking. Nonetheless, this last answer says that the multitasking itself has to be understood as always being under the divine will. So, and I think that's also a really nice answer. And I think when we look at, just in conclusion, when we look at our medieval rabbis, they really set the stage for kind of interpreting the text more meaningful, saying like, just because the story is intercalated, you always could just say that's a chronology. But I think when you look at Rashi and you look at Sforno, you look at the Medrash, you look at Ezra, they said we should never look at a divine text and just say chronology is enough. There always should be more, because there should be a background reason, an underlying reason for why something is happening.
Yeah, okay. So, Rabbi, if I can kind of push you a bit further, right? So, by Jesus healing this woman, it's not like it changed what he was going to do for the husband, for the ruler. Like his daughter was already dead, right? So I can see the case where if she was not dying, Jesus was delayed, and then she died. Yes, right. The interruptions could be same. Like she's dead. Like he came back saying, "My daughter has died." How does it
Well,
matter whether he showed up? So when we look at
Well,
verse,
as you said, the truth is, it could show that he has the central theme of faith, that he had, that didn't matter that she's dead. But even, as I said, even according to Luke, where it says the 12-year-old girl was dying and not that she is dead, it shows you a certain level of faith. So it could be, oh, she's dead, don't come anymore. But no, there was a high level of faith in the 12-year-old girl, 12-year bleeding girl, and there's a high level of faith in the father that his dying or dead girl could be healed. So I think that that focus on Jesus' power of life and death and faith in that is itself one of your first explanation of the intercalation of the text. Okay, Isaac, we'll call it a day.
well, Rabbi, on that note, well, have a great pre-Shabbos. It's great learning. Thank you for highlighting the value, the hidden value between these interconnected stories.
Okay, awesome, Isaac. Okay, have a great
Okay,
day. Bye.
thanks, Rabbi.